and welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 67. I'm the now very much lapsed book blogger, but active podcaster, Charlie Place, and joining me today is the New York Times best-selling author of The Forest of Vanishing Stars, an astonishingly well-written, created, etc. book about Jewish resistance and survival in World War II. As author Patty Callahan Henry says, the question at the heart of this book is how do we figure out who we are? How do we come to become who we are meant to be? And how can we go beyond the definitions that have been placed upon us by other people? So, without further ado, hi Kristin Harmel.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
It's really exciting to have you here. I mean, your book, the cover drew me straight away. I have taken photos of the cover, I've taken photos of the spine.
Thank you so much. And yeah, you're completely right. I love the cover. I got so lucky with this one.
In your previous life as a reporter, you were drawn to what made someone who they were, and also the ordinary heroes in life. Can you tell us how this all segued into your becoming a novelist?
Yeah, that's such a great question. You know, I always knew I wanted to be a novelist, but that felt like a very unrealistic goal when I was younger. And so I decided I would try to become a journalist first. So I actually began writing for local magazines when I was 16. By the time I was 20, I was writing for national magazines such as People Magazine, Glamour, Woman's Day, things like that. And I got to do a lot of interviews over the years. I started writing novels when I was in my mid-20s. And initially I was writing romantic comedies, which of course is very different than what I'm doing now. I'm writing historical fiction now. But I do think that the through line from the very beginning of that journalism career to what I'm doing now is this idea of uncovering what makes people tick and the idea of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, which is essentially what I was primarily tasked with writing about at People Magazine. I did a lot of Heroes Among Us stories, which were the stories of ordinary people who were making a difference in their corner of the world. So I think that's always been a fascination of mine. And I think that one of the most interesting places in which to explore that is within the confines of World War II. Because certainly during that time period, there were a lot of ordinary citizens who felt that call to rise up and do incredible things and who found a way to be the light in the darkness.
That's interesting. I know I had a basic knowledge of you and your web series, which we're going to talk about later, but I hadn't looked into your background prior to novel writing until after I read this book, after I read Forest of Vanishing Stars. And that was a question that I'd kind of had, like why you focused on the story that you did, you know, and then looking at the other books in your backlist that I'm going to have to get to at some point soon. To go to Forest properly, in the 1920s, Yona, then a toddler, is stolen from her family in Berlin by Jerusha, an old woman who believes the family is bad and that she must take the child. Jerusha lives wholly in the forest and she raises Yona to do the same, to gather, to hunt, to fish, and, in case the time ever comes, to kill a person. When Jerusha dies, about 20 years later from the stealing, she tells Yona to stay put, to stay away from the war going on around them. But when Yona comes across a young Jewish child who has been injured running away from the Germans, she has a decision to make: obey Jerusha's rule or use her knowledge to help others. Kristin, should we have that reading?
Yes, absolutely. And that was a much better description than I would have given. So good for you. Okay, so this reading is from the first chapter. It gives a little bit of the flavor of what Yona is about to encounter. You mentioned in your description, Charlie, that Yona is taken from her parents by this older woman named Jerusha. And this is actually the passage where Yona is taken. This is from chapter 1. And I should mention that this is a little bit tonally different from the rest of the book. The first couple of chapters are from Jerusha's viewpoint. And Jerusha really is this woman who feels that she's been called by a higher power, essentially by the forest itself, to take this little girl. The majority of the book is then later from Yona's viewpoint, but this has a little bit of a mystical feel because Jerusha considers herself a mystical force. So this is from chapter 1. The Utener's maid, the timid daughter of a dead sailor, had gone home 2 hours before, and it was a few minutes past 10 o'clock when the Uteners finally turned off their lights. Urusha exhaled. Darkness was her shield. It always had been. She squinted at the closed windows and could just make out the shape of the little girl's infant bed in the room to the right, beyond pale custard curtains. She knew exactly where it was, had been into the room many times when the family wasn't there. She had run her fingers along the pine rails, had felt the power splintering from the curves. Wood had memory, of course, and the first time Urusha had touched the bed where the baby slept, she had been nearly overcome by a warm, white wash of light. It was the same light that had brought her here from the forest 2 years earlier. She had first seen it in June 1920, shining above the treetops like a personal aurora borealis, beckoning her north. She hated the city, abhorred being in a place built by man rather than God, but she knew she had no choice. Her feet had carried her straight to the apartment to bear witness as the raven-haired Frau Utener nursed the baby for the first time. Urusha had seen the baby glowing even then, a light in the darkness no one knew was coming. She didn't want a child. She never had. Perhaps that was why it had taken her so long to act. But nature makes no mistakes. And now, as the sky filled with a cloud of silent blackbirds over the twinkling city, she knew the time had come. It was easy to climb up the ladder of the modern building's fire escape. Easier still to push open the Utener's unlatched window and slip quietly inside. The child was awake, silently watching. Her extraordinary eyes, one twilight blue and one forest green, glimmering in the darkness. Her hair was black as night, her lips the startling red of corn poppies. "I have come for you," Urusha whispered in Yiddish, a language the girl would not yet know. She was startled to realize that her heart was racing. She didn't expect a reply, but the child's lips parted, and she reached out her left hand, palm upturned, the dove-shaped birthmark shimmering in the darkness. She said something soft, something that a lesser person would have dismissed as the meaningless babble of a little girl. But to Urusha, it was unmistakable. "Du sentir," said the girl in Yiddish. "It is you." "Jo, dus bin ich," Urusha agreed. And with that, she picked up the baby, who didn't cry out, and tucking her close against the brittle curves of her body, climbed out the window and shimmied down the iron rail, her feet hitting the sidewalk without a sound. From the folds of Urusha's cloak, the baby watched soundlessly, her mismatched ocean eyes round, as Berlin vanished behind them, and the forest to the north swallowed them whole.
Thank you. Let's put these two questions together, because you've got the fiction and you've got the facts in your book.
Sure.
So if I can ask, you've got a fictional person, you've got Yona, she's fictional, but the history behind the mainstay of the book, the living in the forest, that's real.
Yes, absolutely. And, that tends to be the way I like to write my books. I really do like to invent characters and a plot that center around real historic happenings. That's not the way everyone does it. I think some historic fiction writers prefer to take a real life person and to imagine what their life would have been, giving them complications and thoughts and dialogue and all of those things. I have such great respect for that, but it's just a completely different way of writing than I write. I begin with just months and months of research. And in the case of the Forest of Vanishing Stars, a lot of that research was into the lives of real-life Jewish refugees in the forests of eastern Poland, which is now in the modern day a part of Belarus, during the war. And the most well-known of these groups was a group called the Bielkski Partisans, or the Bielkski Otriad, which was basically started by four brothers with the surname Bielkski, who fled to the forest for various reasons. The older brothers were there a little bit earlier. The younger brother, Aaron, came at the age of 14, a little bit later. And in the beginning, they wound up being a group. I think by that first summer, they were about 30 people strong, but they really set out to recruit people from the Jewish ghettos around the forest and to tell them, if you come with us, you have a chance to survive. And that's what they did. And by the end of the war, this real life group numbered more than 1,200, which I think is just extraordinary. I've always been so moved by the story of the Bielkski brothers and the group they formed. But there were other smaller groups in that forest too. There was a group called the Zoran group. And then there were just smaller groups that history does not remember the names of, or that were just basically family groups that have not widely been written about. And the group at the center of the Forest of Vanishing Stars is more similar to one of those smaller family groups. It never grows as large in size as the Bielkski group. But the way that the characters live, the way they survive, the way they ultimately fight back is very much in line with what we know of the Zoran group and the Bielkski group. And, I was really fortunate in that I was able to speak with the youngest and only still living Bielkski brother, Aaron Bielkski, during the research for this book. And, I have said before, I think that the research that I did prior to speaking to him really helped me get a lot of the facts right. But it was speaking to Aaron Bielkski that I think really gave this book a beating heart. I mean, there's just something extraordinary about talking, one-on-one with someone who really has been in this exact situation, really faced this 80 years ago. And I was very fortunate to be able to connect with him, to meet him and his wife in person, and to have the opportunity to hear his story from his own point of view.
I saw that in your acknowledgements. I actually ended up reading the acknowledgements and author's note before I read the book for some reason. I don't know why I did that. But no, it was really, really interesting to have that information. And yeah, it's astonishing what you've done the research, the book reading, and then you got this interview, which is quite something.
Yeah.
But, I have to ask, you said there are 1,200 people. How on earth did they hide all that time?
It's absolutely incredible. And I think it's hard for us to wrap our minds around now because I think that would be impossible now. The forests are smaller, obviously, because of, population growth. The villages around the forest have basically moved and spread further into the forest. There's been deforestation. The forest is smaller today than it was then. But also surveillance techniques and surveillance technology is very different now. But essentially what this group did was to move fairly frequently. They had guards on the outskirts of their camps, so they knew anytime anybody was coming for them, they could pick up and go. And there was a particularly striking occurrence that is touched upon in the book also. During the summer of 1943, the Germans did enter the forest in an attempt to capture this group and the other groups hiding there. I think prior to that, they had made little excursions into the forest, hoping to capture some of these people. But the forest, it was deep, it was dark, it was swampy, it was winding. And the people who lived within the forest knew the forest, which put them at an enormous advantage over these groups of Germans who were coming in, stumbling their way in, trying to find them. So in the summer of 1943, the Germans basically said, enough. You've been disrupting our communication. You've been disrupting our train lines. You're becoming bothersome. We're going to come in and we're going to get to you. And what the groups did was to flee deeper into the forest in the very, very swampy area in the center of the forest that was essentially impossible for the Germans to march into. I mean, it was water deep enough that it would have covered them up to their necks, up to their shoulders. And for these people fleeing into the swamp, this was about survival. But for the Germans, this was an untenable thing to do, an untenable position. And so the group was able to essentially hide right in the middle of the forest, a day's walk from where these Germans were trying to root them out. So, I mean, it's extraordinary. I think if you're interested in, looking more into this after you've read The Forest of Vanishing Stars, two resources I could recommend that are kind of companion resources are the book Defiance, which is a nonfiction book that came out in 1995, I believe, by an author named Neshama Tech, and the movie that was based on that book, which was a 2008 movie starring Daniel Craig. And Daniel Craig plays Tuvia Bielkski, the oldest Bielkski brother, who is sort of the leader of the Bielkski group. that situation plays itself out in the movie. You can sort of see the director's imagining of how that would have been. And I think it's very accurate. I think it's very true to what it was like at the time. But yeah, that book, Defiance, was very helpful to me in my research for The Forest of Vanishing Stars.
Well, you've said Tuvia there. And I mean, I loved that you had created your own story within the fact. But I was also kind of interested to see if there were any kind of specific characters or events and stuff that you had taken from the history. And I noticed that one of the brothers was called Zeus. And you have a Zeus.
Good observation. Yes, actually, I just loved that name. So interestingly, that character was originally named Baruch in the book, in my book. And my editor just did not feel that that was a name that worked for her. Zeus in the novel, who was originally named Baruch, is a little bit of a romantic interest for Yona. There's a little bit of chemistry there. You know, sometimes a name just doesn't work for a reader. And my editor just felt very strongly that that name didn't say romantic love interest to her for whatever reason. And so we were kind of, looking around for a different name that would have been period appropriate, that would have been culturally appropriate. And I kept coming back to the name Zeus, which was one of the names, as you mentioned, of the Bielkski brothers. But it's just a sexy name. I just like that name, Zeus. I mean, what's not to like? And so he was not named after Zeus, the Bielkski brother, but that is certainly where I kept coming across the name. And it was certainly proof that that name would have been appropriate in that region for that culture at that time. So yes, not a deliberate ode to Zeus, but man, I love that name.
No, brilliant. I know that I'm pretty sure, obviously it's earlier on in the book, but I think you do reference the Greek god as well.
Oh, do I don't even, it's so funny. I know this is my most recent release, but the schedule of publishing, it's such a strange thing because I've already completed my next book, which means that this book has already, I remember it. I'm sitting here talking about it with you, but it's funny. Some of those details you sort of forget because you have to almost put it on the shelf in order to open your mind and move into the next project. So I'm, when I do interviews like this, sometimes I'm surprised by things that are in the pages of my own book. I'm like, oh, that's interesting that happens.
Well, it's that kind of everybody reads the book and has their own interpretation as well. You've got that as well.
Yeah, that's very true. Absolutely, yes.
So I've got a question. I don't know if maybe you can answer it. I mean, you've obviously done so much research. Is there a reason that this situation of so many people hiding in the forest, of the Bielskis themselves as well, is there a reason it's not so well known?
I think that when the movie came out, when the Daniel Craig movie came out at the end of 2008, I think that changed the world's recognition of the Bielkski group. But it's actually quite sad. They didn't have much recognition before that, largely because I think when that area was liberated and, these refugees emerged from the forest and went back to their towns, what they were essentially faced with was that there was no place for them in these towns. They had been forced out, not just by the Germans, but by their fellow townspeople who, in many cases, for various reasons, were only too happy to see them go. People had taken over their homes. People had taken over their businesses. A lot of them, there was no place to go back to. And so a lot of them left. A lot of them left the country that had been their country for generations. And a lot of them, I think, went ultimately to what would become Israel. And I think a lot of the people who found themselves in Israel at the beginning of the founding of that country had come through incredible circumstances and come from incredible backgrounds and had incredible stories. So although this one now in retrospect is extraordinary looking back, I think at the time a lot of the people who survived in the forest did not feel that what they had done or what they had fought through was any more extraordinary than what other survivors had endured. And I think that also, and I think it's one of the reasons why even today we struggle to know the stories of our grandparents, right? Of our parents, of our grandparents, of our great-grandparents. I think a lot of people came through that time period and then just didn't speak of it again or bore what they had gone through stoically and silently. And so I think that to some extent, those stories weren't told. also for many of the people who remained, that was a part of the world that was out of touch with the rest of the world for a long time because of events that happened after World War II. So I think that was a component of it. You know, I mentioned before, I think it's sort of sad that the older Bielkski brothers never really got the recognition for what they did in their lifetimes. One of the Bielkski brothers was actually killed about a year after liberation. His name was Azael. Tuvia died sort of in obscurity. I mean, he lived in Israel for a while, then he came to the United States. I believe he founded a trucking company with his brother Zeus. I think they worked as drivers, as cab drivers. They just sort of had what we would consider ordinary lives, despite the fact that he had been the leader of this group that was responsible for saving 1,200 innocent lives. I mean, it's staggering to think of what he did and then to realize that after the war, there was very little recognition for that. But I think now that recognition has come. I mean, I think Aaron Bielkski spent many years talking about what happened in the forest. He and his wife, I think, really made a point to lecture as often as they could and to share his story, which I think is very admirable.
Yeah, I finished your book and I suppose grateful is the word. Yeah, I was really grateful that although obviously it's a really harrowing tale, and I mean, there's a particular scene in the book kind of early on, and it's not actually to do with the group that you focus on, but it was absolutely horrific. It's possibly one of the worst, if not the worst, things in a World War II fiction I've read, but obviously absolutely spot on in what you've done and what you've said. But I was really glad when I finished the book. I just thought, I'm just so glad to know this, and I'm so glad that you've written about it. You furthered the knowledge of it.
I appreciate that. And I think it's important when writing about World War II not to shy away from the darkness, because that was part of it. I mean, we should remember that there were these terrible things that happened, and there were people who stood by and let it happen. I think it's important to realize that too. But equally, I think it's important to realize that in these times of darkness, in these times of terrible, terrible things, there was also goodness. This was also a time when people rose up and did good, kind, decent things for humanity. I mean, people who genuinely saved others and gave us hope for the future of mankind. And I think that it's important to remember that I think in every period of historical darkness, there's always light, and the light comes from people doing good things. And what that means is that we have the ability to do good things and to provide light in our own moments of history.
Mm-hmm. Given what you said here, I think this question will flow straight off. The title, absolutely gorgeous. It was one of the things that first caught me, as well as that gorgeous cover. And I know that it ended up being effectively group produced. But I wanted to ask, you have the reference to Vanishing Stars and stars themselves, and you've got stars in the forest. Obviously, you've got stars that give light. Are you able to talk about the theme as such of stars in your book?
Yeah. So you mentioned that was not the original title, and that this title was group produced, as you said. You're absolutely right. It's funny. It's actually astonishing to me that was not always the title, but sometimes the title is right in front of us, staring us in the face, and we just don't see it. My initial title for this book was The Dove of the Dark Forest, which was obviously not the right title, but, Yona has a birthmark in the shape of a dove on her wrist. They're in this dark forest. I liked the alliteration. I kind of get fixated on this title. And when you get stuck on one, it's very hard to think of the book as something else. So I really did need to call in the help of some author friends, of my editor, of my publicist, of my agent. And thank goodness, collectively, everybody's way smarter than I am. So we came up with the great title for the book. But yeah, the theme of stars, I don't know if I would call stars a theme, but it's sort of a recurring symbol throughout, or a recurring motif perhaps throughout. And stars, as a side note, seem to find their way into my writing quite often. And in fact, with my novel that I wrote about 10 years ago called The Sweetness of Forgetting, which was my first World War II novel, the line between the two main characters that binds them together through the years is, as long as there are stars in the sky, I will always love you. And so that is sort of this recurring thought and this recurring theme in that book. And that wound up being the line my husband proposed to me with.
Oh.
So stars kind of originated in my writing and then have become a part of my life. But in this book, I think that it made the title, The Forest of Vanishing Stars, made sense on a lot of levels. For one thing, as they move deeper into the forest, especially during the summer when the overhead leaf cover is very thick, which is one of the things that helps them to hide. You had asked about that before, about how they managed to successfully disappear into the forest. One of the things was that in the depths of the forest, in the center of the forest, you really couldn't see them from overhead because the leaf cover, the tree cover was so thick. But that also meant that from down below, the deeper you got into the forest and the safer you were, the fewer stars you could see overhead. So the stars were essentially vanishing from their view. Another level of the title is that as these people who had been forced to wear stars moved into the forest, they essentially were able to vanish into the forest, taking these stars with them. And many of them discarded their forced upon stars, which also meant that those stars were vanishing. So there were just sort of several levels to the idea of vanishing stars. But for me, I think stars have always been fascinating in the way that they connect us across generations, across time, and across place. And they're always a constant. I think a lot looking up at the sky myself about, I'm looking up at this sky, but so are people I love that are hundreds of miles away from me or thousands of miles away from me. There's just this idea that wherever we are in the world, we're beneath the same sky. And also this idea that something as common as looking up at the stars, right? Something that you and I have probably both done at some point over the last month, even if we haven't thought about it. That's something people have been doing for hundreds and thousands of years, right? I mean, to me, that's something that connects us across time. And it's those little points of commonality across the years. I think it's just one of those things that reminds us that we're not that different. You know what I mean? That we're not that different after all. Years can pass. We can be from different countries. We can be from different cultures. We can be from different parts of the world, different backgrounds, but we all are living beneath the same stars in the same sky. To me, it's just part of that concept that our similarities in the end always outweigh our differences.
That's a lovely way of thinking of it. Definitely, yeah. You've got the connection there and the connection of all people, not just through history, but also the present day in their context as well. Yeah. I'm glad I asked you that question. That was really, really interesting answer.
Thanks.
So, completely different question here, I realise, but the reading from the start of the book introduces us straight away to Jerusha's mysticism.
Yeah.
Why did you want to bring in this mysticism if it, we never really know if it's real or not? Yeah. What was the reason for including all this?
Well, that's one of the things I like about Jerusha. I don't know whether it's real or not. Jerusha certainly believes that she has these special powers, and she may. I mean, there are things in the book, predictions that she made that seem to come true, for instance. But I also like the idea with Jerusha that it creates the question of what came first, the chicken or the egg, in a way. So Jerusha justifies taking Yona because she feels that, like I said, that the forest has called her to do it. She's been called by forces greater than herself to take this little girl. She can't refuse. And her reason for taking the little girl is she feels that she's saving her from these parents who are terrible. And certainly we see at the beginning of the book that Yona's father is an enthusiastic follower of Hitler as early as 1920, right? So we have the sense this is probably not such a quality person. This is probably not a very good man. But then it begs the question, did Jerusha foresee the future that the father would have and save Yona from that future? Or did taking his daughter on her second birthday from her safe, warm infant bed in his safe apartment change the course of his life? I mean, certainly it altered everything, right? So was he always going to become the person he became? Or did Jerusha's choice change his direction and send him into this future that would not have otherwise been his future? So I love questions like that. I love thinking about that. I love thinking about, was she the cause of this, or was she simply responding to forces that were already at work? And ultimately, to me, the question at the core of this novel is one of identity. I mean, that is really something that Yona struggles with. She comes from this family that has a father who she finds out, as I said, is a Nazi, right? He's someone who agreed with Hitler's viewpoints even very early on. And she feels a lot of guilt over that. She wonders about her responsibility, just that it's his blood running through her veins. But she's also raised by this woman, Yerusha, who comes from a long tradition of Jewish women. And she chooses to ally herself with these Jewish refugees. And later, in a town in the forest, she crosses paths briefly with a group of Catholic nuns who she kind of allies herself with also. So I think that at the heart of this book is the question of who are we? What makes us who we are? Are we who we're born to be? Are we who we're raised to be by the people who raise us? Or are we who we choose to be? Or perhaps are we some combination of all three things? And I don't necessarily have the answer to that question. I don't know that Yona ever reaches the answer to that question, but I think it's a very interesting question to explore because I think it's something that pertains to all of us. I think all of us are some version of ourselves that was not entirely what we were born to be or what we were raised to be because, we make choices that shape the course of our lives. And so to me, it's important and interesting to explore a question like that. And I love the idea of how much of our future is written into our blood or, kind of written into the stories of our ancestors, even if we don't know those stories. I mean, I don't know. I'm just kind of fascinated by that idea. And to me, the character of Yerusha plays into all of that because she's what sets this story into motion.
I want to ask, actually, if you have an idea yourself, what might have happened, do you think, if Yona hadn't been stolen? Would her father have been the same person? How would his relationship been with his wife? Might she have lived? What would have gone on, do you think?
In my opinion, I think his life would have been different. I can't say that he wouldn't have made the same choices in terms of his military career. To me, her father was someone who was ambitious and somebody who had bought into this rhetoric as a way to elevate his own position. So he might have made some similar choices, but I think he would have been a less hardened man. And I think that by the time, and this is a little bit of a spoiler, but, we do meet Yona's father again later in the book. And by the time we meet him again, I think he's basically holding himself together by a thread. Like on the outside, he looks like he's completely in control. He has, this high military position. He's one of the ones giving orders. But I think he's just within a very close distance of essentially unraveling. And I think that is probably at least in part because of the things that Yerusha set into motion. But I mean, that's the thing about forks in the road and circumstance and the things that shape us. It's interesting to look back and wonder what might have been, how the future might have changed if something different had happened along the way. But I think that there are also moments in life that set us on a new path in a way that there's no turning back from. And so it's difficult for me to say how different his life would have been because I think that there were so many of those forks in the road, some of which happened to him, some of which he chose, that there would have been no way back, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one because I know, obviously, when you start the book, you're thinking, okay, so Yerusha's taken Yona from Berlin. Okay, so yes, we can see that there's probably going to be later on, the parents are maybe going to be Nazis. And I do love how you effectively question that later. This whole time, I know for me, I was thinking, okay, so, all right, surviving in the forest isn't exactly a modern day kind of thing that Yona might have thought she would have for herself as a baby. But when you get to that point where you are questioning if Yerusha hadn't taken her, would all this be different? Would the father be a good guy? That's quite something. I did really like that, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when I was writing this book, at the beginning of writing the book, I did not realize how much a part of the book the question of identity would be. I did not set out to write a book about identity. But I think that tends to happen. I think these themes pop up without the author necessarily intending them to, and they just present themselves. And grow more strongly within the narrative, and then they become these interesting questions at the core of the story. So for this, as the person writing the book, being confronted with those questions as the plot moved forward, I think helped me to deepen my understanding of the characters and the conflicts that they would find themselves in, both internally and externally. And again, I just think the question of what makes us who we are is an endlessly fascinating one that I will probably find myself unintentionally exploring in future books too.
I look forward to that. No, definitely.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, having this conversation with you, I'm just seeing just how appropriate, just really, really appropriate the question of identity is in your novel on these so many levels. I didn't know where the book was going to end up, but I was actually really surprised by how you ended it with Yona. I suppose the question I have is, why did you feel the need to have her die?
So she doesn't actually die. I've gotten a lot of emails about that. I've gotten a lot of questions about that. So in the final chapter, the second to the last chapter, there's a confrontation with Yona and her father. And Yona is shot by her father by accident. He's not aiming for her. He's aiming for Zeus, who's trying to protect her. Yona, at the last minute, makes a decision to try to put herself in front of Zeus. And in doing so, I believe, saves his life. He picks her up and carries her away. And the last line of that chapter is, as the last of the light slipped away, he carried her out of the clearing, back toward the camp, his tears falling warm on her frozen face as the world faded around her and the stars vanished from the sky. So there's another Vanishing Stars reference, right? So it was a little bit of a misdirect. I mean, not intentionally. I wasn't trying to be tricky. I wasn't like, she dies, but then she doesn't. But it was a little bit of, she was willing to give her life for him. And in doing so, this would have essentially disproved Urusha's prediction for her, right? Urusha had given her this prediction that she was going to live to a certain age and, these things would happen. And she was trading that all for the chance to save someone she loved. She had finally become part of a family. She had finally realized what love was. Like all of these things that she worried that she wasn't capable of or that would never happen for her. But then in the final chapter, which is chapter 28, in the final 3 paragraphs, we learn, it says, many years later, well into the next millennium, children still told tales of the old woman who lived deep in the heart of the Nalabaka forest, the one with one green eye and one blue. Some wondered if she was real at all, though others swore they had seen her singing to the stars, speaking to the squirrels, swaying with the trees. And then it goes on and talks a little bit about her. In my mind, that was Yona surviving. And I can see that some might read that as she had died and this was just maybe her ghost in the forest or just tall tales that children were telling. But in my mind, she saved Zeus, retreated to the heart of the forest that had always protected her, and built a life of happiness there. She chose not to reemerge into society, but instead had a wonderful life in the place that had sheltered her and that had formed her and that had made her who she was.
That makes me so happy. I thought she had died.
I've in one of my other books, and I'm not going to say which one, but I will say that in my World War II books, the characters do not always get a happy ending because I don't think that's realistic. I mean, you can't write about World War II and everyone in every book lives happily ever after because that's not how World War II was. There were people who died tragically, and especially the people who stood up and did heroic things. I think they had a much higher risk of not surviving. So in one of my books in particular, the protagonist actually does not survive. But I think in my own way, I did give her sort of a fitting, happy ending, which sounds strange, and especially without telling you which book it is. But I always endeavor to do that, to tie the book up in a way that is emotionally satisfying and that fits with the arc of this story. And to me, that ending, Yona almost dying, but surviving essentially because of the forest that has always protected her, that felt like the right ending, as did her decision to remain in the forest, even when she could have walked out and re-entered society.
I like that. Yeah, I'm definitely going to need to think about the book and reinterpret it. Yeah. But yeah, so wow, yeah. Where do I go from here? So I mean, when Urusha steals Yona, did you have the ending planned?
No. Well, yes and no. So I outlined very thoroughly. So by the time I finished the outline, I knew how the book was going to end. But when I started the outline, which is really the beginning of the plotting, I had no idea where it was going to go. I didn't sit down and think, okay, this is a book that begins this way and ends this way. What happens in the middle? People often ask how I created Yerusha or why I created Yerusha. Yerusha just kind of came to me. I mean, we talked earlier about the roles she plays in the book, but sometimes these characters just plunk into your head fully formed. And for me, Yerusha was one of those characters. As soon as I knew the role she needed to play in the novel, she immediately was this very real character to me. So I knew exactly how the book was going to start. I knew how Yerusha was going to set things in motion. I knew what Yona's years were going to be like before she encountered the refugees. And I knew what the beginning of the refugee tale was going to be. But at the beginning of writing the outline, that was pretty much all I knew. I knew a few historical milestones along the way. I knew that they would flee into the forest in the summer of 1943. I knew there would come a time they'd fight back. I knew there would come a time when she found herself in a town and encountered these nuns who were based on the real life martyrs of Novogrodic. So, I knew those little milestones along the way, but I didn't really know where the story was going. By the time I finished the outline, I did. But that's why the outlining process is so interesting to me, because it's where I figure out all the beats of the story and all of the sort of emotional arcs that the characters are going to follow along without having to be too held up by finding the most beautiful use of language. So that comes in the first draft, the language, the fleshing out of the story, the coloring in of this world that I've outlined. But the outline stage is just really exciting to me because it's where all of the puzzle pieces sort of appear and then I figure out where to put them. And so, yeah, that was a revelation to me during the outline stage.
Mm-hmm. So I know that you wrote this book during the pandemic. So obviously you couldn't do the same sort of research that you might do. You couldn't go overseas, etc.
Yeah.
Do you think you might go to the forest yourself sometime?
Oh, certainly. I mean, it's in a part of the world that I would say is probably not particularly safe right now. And so I don't plan to go immediately. But yes, absolutely. In normal times, I had actually planned to go to the forest. I've never written a book before without going to the place. I think it's vital to go to the place. I think going to the place you're writing about, spending time in the place you're writing about is one of the most important pieces of research you can do, because there are things that you learn and that you soak in and that you take in from standing in a place, from smelling the air, from feeling the soil beneath your feet, that you can't get from conversations or from reading research material. You have to put your feet in the place. But I sold this book about a month before the pandemic started. And it therefore, obviously, at that time in 2020, became impossible to go to Belarus. I mean, it just wasn't a possible thing at the time. And so I do not think I would have been able to complete this book if I had not crossed paths with a man named Vadim Sidorovich, who is a Belarusian forest guide who lives in the Nalibaki forest and who has made it his life's work to research and know everything about this forest. So he's written a book about the flora, the fauna, and the human history of the forest. He leads ecotourism guided tours into the forest. And at the time I reached out to him to ask for his help, his ecotourism business had essentially been shut down because of COVID. Nobody was coming from Western Europe to take these tours of the forest. So it was kind of this case of perfect timing. He had this time that he hadn't had before. He had the need to supplement a little bit of the income that he had lost. And what we wound up doing was I paid him by the hour to answer every single question I had. And at first, I kind of didn't know how it was going to work. I thought, all right, well, I've read his book about the flora, fauna, and human history. He has a ton of stuff in there. I can probably glean most of what I need to know from that and then just check the details with him to make sure they were right. He wound up being a godsend. I would send him a passage and say, is this correct? And he would add in several more things about how things smelled or how things felt or how things tasted. Or he would say, oh, yes, that mushroom is a mushroom that grows in the forest, but it actually grows a half mile south of the area that you're talking about. Or that flower, this chapter takes place the first week of May, but that flower doesn't actually bloom usually until the third week of May. I mean, it was these little teeny tiny details that I never would have thought of or never would have even thought to check, because I would have said to myself, well, I know this mushroom is in that forest, or I know this flower is in that forest. But he knew these little teeny tiny details that there's no way in the world I would have known. And I think if I had gone to the forest, I would have relied more on my own observations of the forest, which would have been the observations made in an uneducated way over the course of a week or two. But because I was forced to rely on his eyes, his ears, and his brain as my knowledge of the forest, I think the book was better for it. And I don't think that would have necessarily been the case with just a random person I was working with. He just happened to be the absolute perfect person to provide these insights. And he did it in such a kind, generous, willing way. I honestly could never thank him enough. The forest came alive as a character in this book because of his input. And I am just filled with gratitude because of that.
The most authentic, location-based historical fiction book, then, definitely. Yes.
Yes, I know. And all because I didn't get to go to the forest. What an irony. But yeah, he was fantastic.
So I can see the clock. I'm going to ask, what's next in terms of this book you have been talking about writing right now?
Yeah, so my next novel, The Paris Daughter, is due out in the United States next June. I imagine it'll probably be coming in the UK around that same time, but it'll be out sometime in 2023. It is a return to World War II Paris, which is something I've written about a lot. I used to live in Paris. My paternal grandmother's side of the family is from Paris. I feel a lot of an attachment to Paris. So I always love writing about that area. But this is about two mothers, two daughters, an Allied bomb that falls where it shouldn't in the suburbs of Paris, two families that are destroyed, and then a chance meeting in New York in 1960 that reawakens these mysteries that were sort of lost in World War II. And that might finally be solved now against all odds. I don't really have my pitch down yet, but that is sort of what it's going to be about. The Paris Daughter, coming in June of 2023.
Okay, fascinating specifics. Look forward to that, definitely.
Thank you.
I have really, really welcomed the chance to research the heck out of you, because it has let me listen to and watch Friends and Fiction a lot more than I had previously now, and I'm going to make more excuses for this to happen as well more. So can you tell us about Friends and Fiction and also about the Edition Writer's Block, the podcast?
Yes, absolutely. So Friends and Fiction is an online group that has actually become sort of a real world group that was founded by 5 best-selling authors, including myself, at the beginning of the pandemic. One of the authors, Mary Alice Monroe, has left the group, but it is still run by me and the other 3 founders, who are Mary Kay Andrews, Patty Callahan Henry, and Christy Woodson Harvey. We all had books that were coming out at the beginning of the pandemic. We all had book tours that had been canceled. We were very concerned about supporting independent booksellers and about connecting with our readers, which we normally would have done at independent bookstores on book tour on the road. So we decided to start an online group where we would talk about books. We would encourage people to continue supporting independent booksellers, so that they didn't go out of business during the pandemic. And we thought, we'll do it for 7 weeks, because clearly by the end of 7 weeks, everything would be back to normal. We thought COVID was just going to be solved by the end of that May. Well, as you know, that did not happen. But by that time, it had really picked up. We had hundreds of people watching it. We were astonished at the impact it was already beginning to make with independent booksellers. And we decided to start inviting guests on. So we decided to extend Friends and Fiction indefinitely. And here we are, almost 2.5 years later, still doing Friends and Fiction every week. It is a live show every Wednesday at 7:00 Eastern, which would unfortunately be, I guess, the middle of the night. It would be midnight in the UK, right? But it's also available. You can always watch it after the fact on Facebook or on YouTube. But it's also a huge community. We have almost 80,000 readers who are members of our Facebook community. And so sort of the central part of Friends and Fiction is our weekly show, where we interview other authors, other best-selling authors, usually, sometimes debut authors. But all week long, 24/7, people are posting on the page, talking about the books they're loving, asking for recommendations, sharing stories of how books or authors have changed their lives. And it's just become this wonderful, vibrant community that we're so, so proud of and so happy to be a part of. As part of that, we've also launched a podcast called the Writer's Block Podcast, hosted by Ron Block, who is a very well-known librarian in Ohio, hence the name Writer's Block, because his last name is Block. So in addition to the actual web show running as an audio podcast, there's also a new original episode that drops every Friday, where Ron, often with the Four Friends in Fiction hosts, interviews other people in publishing. So on our show, we almost exclusively focus on adult fiction, but on the podcast, we have a little bit more leeway to focus on young adult fiction, to focus on audiobooks, to focus on, the people behind publishing, to focus on sort of more aspects of it. So it's just been wonderful. It's been fulfilling. We feel like we've done some good in the literary world. We love talking to all of these other writers and publishing professionals. For us, it was the best thing to come out of the pandemic. And those three writers, Mary Kay Andrews, Patty Callahan Henry, and Christy Woodson Harvey, have become three of my very dearest friends. So, the camaraderie between us and the friendship between us is very real. And I think that comes across. And we've started doing live events too, which has been wonderful. It's wonderful to get back out in the real world and meet in person hundreds of the people who have been with us on Friends in Fiction and who are members of our community.
Mm-hmm. No, it's very good. And I know lots of people have heard and listened to it before, but if anyone hasn't who's listening right now, do go and check it out. And yeah, the friendship does come across. I mean, I think that's the special thing about it. You've got that uniqueness, which is the way you guys just discuss together. And it's just so nice. It's just so nice to sit down and listen to it or watch it.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, that means a lot coming from you. So thank you very much for saying that. I appreciate it.
So, Kristin, this has been wonderful having you here today. I'm glad we did the spoilers and the talking about the ending. And I'm glad just to have you on, just to, read your book with this in mind. Thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And thank you for asking such wonderful, insightful questions. It's always such a pleasure, especially to talk to a podcast host who really digs deep and who asks such thoughtful, insightful things. So thank you for a wonderful interview.
Links to purchase The Forest of Vanishing Stars are in the episode description. Thank you very much for listening. Please do share this episode with anyone you think would be interested in it. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 67, was recorded on the 12th of August and published on the 22nd of August, 2022. Music and production by Charlie Place.